It's incredibly difficult to play a video game in a vacuum these days. 20 years ago, I remember buying games based purely on the box art and whatever was written on the back, and I played and finished them long before I ever engaged with any reviews. Now, unless you play on day one and avoid the internet until you finish the game, you'll have a hard time avoiding the opinions of others. Still, when I'm excited for a game, I do try to avoid the online discourse, because, like it or not, spoilers and negativity will affect the way you play a game. So it was with Starfield then, Bethesda's highly anticipated space RPG. I was excited enough for this one that I actually played on day -5, because apparently that's how things work now. I finished it a few weeks later, largely avoiding the online dialogue. And you know what? I enjoyed it. It isn't perfect, but it's bigger than I possibly could have imagined, and a lot of fun. Best of all, after spending 70 hours in the game, I still felt like I had only barely scratched the surface of what it had to offer.
Happy you're here, Captain.
Imagine my surprise then when I emerged from my cocoon to discover that the internet had made Starfield public enemy number 1, before slowly phasing it out of the conversation altogether. I read and watched a lot of reviews, and there's plenty of valid criticism out there. But as someone who genuinely enjoyed the game, and on behalf of all the others who also did, I feel it's my duty to defend Starfield's honour as best I can. So, point by point, I'm going to do my best to confront the various problems people had with the game, without spoilers, in order to demonstrate to you, dear viewer, how best you can enjoy your time with Starfield. For the sake of balance though, and before I launch into defending the game, I will just mention a few things that I found indisputably bothersome. Bland planets. I get they're going for a degree of realism in Starfield, but without changing anything else about the planets. I think they could be a lot more fun if they were more often colourful instead of generally beige. The cumbersome menus. There's a simple solution here. Just give me a proper space Pip-Boy and transfer all the menu stuff into there. The temple minigame thing. This is barely fun to begin with and just gets more and more tiresome. Please, stop making me fly through sparkles. The bugs. Though this game is surprisingly well polished for Bethesda, on my first playthrough I was unable to complete 4 different quests due to a bug which meant the various NPCs I needed to talk to had moved off planet and left no forwarding address. The bugs. Though there are some scary creatures, I think this game vastly underuses bug-like creatures as enemies. The bugs. I'm convinced that the Constellation companions have snuck a microphone or 2 into my spacesuit, because even when I leave them at the lodge or on my spaceship, they still seem to know every single detail of my life before I can tell them anything. The bugs. I don't think the various illnesses you can catch have enough of an effect on gameplay. The bugs. No. I don't think I can think of any more bugs. So, on to defending the game now then. Loading screens. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I like loading screens. I don't. And I'm not going to pretend like Starfield hasn't got a lot of loading screens either. Because it does. I do think it's fair to say that they only seem so egregious because we've been spoilt lately by games like Spider-Man 2, where there's essentially no loading screens. But I also think the amount of loading screens you'll experience in the game depends on how you're playing it. For one thing, if you have a quest marker active for space travel before you get into space, it makes that process a whole lot smoother. And you can also land somewhere using a marker without heading back into a menu, and I wish they made these things clearer. More importantly though, if you take your time exploring each location and finish what you're doing in one settlement or on one planet before travelling to the next, then you can go quite a long time without experiencing any loading screens. If you're a completionist who just wants to get everything done as fast as possible, or you focus on the main story and dart between locations as you get the quests, then you're probably going to have a bad time. This is not a game that is fun to rush through. Honestly, I do wish that more of these loading screens were disguised with cutscenes, like the visuals you get when flying between systems or docking your ship. And I think more of them could have been disguised with airlocks or elevators too. But all in all, given how much there is to this universe, I don't think they're as bad as people say. And they're certainly made a lot more fun if you use photo mode a lot too. I also think it's worth noting that in a game like Starfield, you'll want to be saving frequently. and the loading screens do this automatically for you. So maybe it helps to think of them as a quick save without a menu. I'm reaching, I know, because there are some places where an abundance of loading screens is essentially unavoidable, like in Neon, for example. But generally speaking, so long as you know what you're in for, and use the loading screens to take a breather and rest your eyes, they're not too bad. Empty planets. Obviously, when the game gives you 1,000 planets, they can't possibly all have cool stuff on them. But when I played No Man's Sky at launch, I never even found one planet with cool stuff on it. I'm told that game has improved since, but I'm still not sure it's for me. To be honest with you, I find the empty planet criticism a bit confusing. It seems like everyone else is landing on random planets, looking around and saying, "This is so empty and boring," while I land on a planet and wonder to myself, who the heck is setting up all these research stations, and why have they all been taken over by space pirates? I personally haven't found a single planet where there was absolutely nothing, though obviously I haven't been to them all. I understand there are lore reasons, but they can't possibly justify this number of research stations. Regardless, I was genuinely hoping to land on a planet with absolutely nothing there, and I haven't yet, though I'm told they're out there. Weirdly, I think they probably would have received less complaints if they were all genuinely empty, because what seems to annoy people most is having to spacewalk between these abandoned structures. It makes sense then that if there were no abandoned structures, there'd be nothing to spacewalk between and therefore nothing to complain about. The truth of the matter here is that this bit of the game just isn't for everyone. I think people misunderstand what most of these planets are for. Every system or planet with interesting handcrafted stuff on it is marked pretty clearly on your map. So if you want properly built out locations with plenty of quests, then you can find that pretty easily. Sure, it would have been nice to have more interesting random encounters on random planets, but it's clear that's just not why they're in the game. If you want to set up a base, find loot, mine resources, or scan flora and fauna, you can do that on the random planets. If you're someone who wants to explore every possible inch of a game's map, like in Skyrim or Fallout, then you just can't do that here. The universe is too vast, and that's kind of the point. The procedurally generated planets exist to offer player-led survival game aspects, which aren't for everyone. Some people, though, will land on an empty planet and see a blank slate to make their own. And I think that opportunity within the game is made so much more valuable by existing within the context of the populated worlds and stories that Starfield also has to offer. Boundaries, space and land. The only reason anybody would want to walk around the entire circumference of a planet is because they want internet points. No sensible human being would want to spend their precious time doing that. And besides, you can't say you find exploring the planets boring and yet also want to walk around the entire circumference of it. I think this is largely a problem of expectations being set wrong, because in some piece of Starfield marketing or some interview, the wrong thing was said or somehow misinterpreted. Likely because it's difficult to explain a lot of the game's systems without resorting to hyperbole. Ultimately though, this is a non-issue. Boundaries in space are more of a problem in my opinion. It's clear that it's more realistic for the game to say, no, you cannot fly to that planet or star system without a transition, because that would take far too long. But they should have just made super fast speedy ships and explained it away, honestly. If your expectations were set by a game like No Man's Sky, then it can feel a bit weird to be flying around in space without actually reaching anywhere. It also means the space stuff is way more engaging when there are space stations or large ships around that you can dock with, because you can actually approach them. Mostly though, I view the space stuff as an opportunity for ship combat and the occasional encounter.
Damn it, I am sick of you pirates!
Talking heads. Starfield has actually received a lot of praise for being a significant visual step up from Bethesda's previous games, but it's also received criticism for the way that characters look and talk. Personally, I think most characters look good, and some of the main characters look even better. I also think the animations here are vastly improved over Fallout 4, and within the context of a game this big, they're more than good enough.
It has been a very long time since I have been someplace that could possibly feel like home.
This is one of those things where your perception will be mostly affected by whatever game you played before Starfield. If you play this game after Cyberpunk or anything else which looks exceptionally good in this regard, then it might be a bit jarring, but I don't think it's objectively bad. Honestly, the thing I don't see mentioned as much, which I think is a much fairer criticism, is the decision they made to lock you into this classic POV camera angle for all conversations. Obviously, after ditching a voiced protagonist, they've also eschewed all the fancy cinematic angles that were in Fallout 4, which is fine I guess, but it does feel a bit strange going back to this in Starfield. I think I would have preferred, like in Cyberpunk, that they not lock your camera at all, so that you can jump or walk around while having a conversation, so long as you're still facing the character. Because it's especially awkward when there are several characters talking and the game cuts between them. I imagine there are plenty of good reasons, and probably a lot to do with the animations, that they locked the camera in the end. But it's especially weird considering in Fallout 4 you could actually break out of cinematics and jump around like this. I don't need it to look amazing, but I'd like to leap around while talking to someone if possible, or even walk away from the conversation altogether in some instances.
You bastards back for round 2. What? Who the hell are you?
By the way, I'm actually kind of split on the whole voice protagonist thing. I know many people weren't keen on Fallout 4's voice protagonist because they would always say the wrong thing the wrong way, but I never had a huge issue with it. In the end, this probably works better for Starfield, but maybe I'm in the minority in missing a voice protagonist a little bit. Maps. I love good maps in games because they provide an obvious means for investigating every conceivable corner of a level, but I also find they become a bit of a crutch. Rather than exploring freely, I tend to wind around the map like a snake, trying to find fast travel points or collectibles. One of the reasons people dislike fast travel and loading screens in Starfield is because they'd like to spend less time in menus, and I would too. Not having a proper map for places like New Atlantis encourages more free-form exploration, and discourages pressing the menu button constantly to check you're in the right place or heading the right way. And I reckon that's a good thing. Sure, it might be helpful to know where in a city I can buy guns so I can get there quicker, but it's much more fun and immersive to actually engage with the world. There are NPCs you can ask to point you in the right direction, for one thing, and there are usually plenty of signs around too. Taking the long way to go buy ammo means you'll see more of a location and discover more quests and details. It also means that after spending some time in the city, your exploration is rewarded with a genuine familiarity with the layout, which draws you further into the world. I know Bethesda are due to add proper maps to the game, but I personally think you should use them as little as possible. No vehicles. I will admit that if I was landing a spaceship on a planet, I would probably park closer to the abandoned research station than my Starfield character does. But I think here it's worth focusing on the question of, why are you even on this planet? Why did you land here in the first place? If you land at a handcrafted location full of quests, then you're almost always put right in the thick of it, so that's fine. If you want to build a base or mine specific materials on a random planet though, then you'll need to be scouting the area anyway. If you're landing on a planet to do the terrible temple minigame thing, then the game wants you to find the temple first, and it's usually not that much of a spacewalk away. But look, I get it. Jetpack boosting towards a map marker on a procedurally generated planet is not inherently that fun. There are always plants or rocks you can scan, and usually some creatures or enemies too. But unless you want resources, XP, or particularly enjoy scanning the flora and fauna, then it's arguably not worth your time. You're simply not going to encounter handcrafted details along your route. Sometimes, with the right conditions, planet surfaces with low gravity, for example, are a lot more fun to explore, but a lot of them are pretty barren and uninteresting. Ultimately though, there are not that many instances in the game where you're forced to spacewalk across vast nothingness. So if you don't enjoy doing that, then you can just generally avoid it. Outdated game design. I don't make video games, I just play them. And I guarantee that is also true of most, if not all, of the people saying this sort of thing. I think when people say outdated game design, what they really mean is doesn't play like Spider-Man 2. And that as a result of loading screens and menus and graphics and other stuff I've talked about. But look, if Bethesda had really wanted to achieve no loading screens in this game, I think they could have. But they would have had to sacrifice a lot of stuff that people love about their games in order to do so, as well as a lot of the new stuff that they've added in Starfield. Unfortunately, it's all about compromises. I think in the end you have to be able to meet a game on its own terms. Comparing it to Cyberpunk or Baldur's Gate 3, despite common elements, is generally pointless. Other games do things Starfield doesn't, but Starfield does plenty more things that no other game can manage to combine in quite the same way. They just can't do everything. The price of the freedom the game gives you is some rough edges which sometimes mean you have to fill in the gaps in your own head. Allowing you to reconfigure your entire ship, or build an outpost, or customize spacesuits and weapons necessarily requires that certain aspects be arguably less impressive in the game. And speaking of weapons, no unique weapons. I like unique weapon variants in games, but they're also a double-edged sword. Right? The problem is this, and I'm sure I'm not alone here, but if a game features unique weapon variants, then once I've acquired even 2 or 3 of those, then that is all I'm going to use. Because why would I not use the unique, cool variants? Even if I look at the stats and they're worse than another gun I have, I feel I'd be missing out if I was not using the unique variants. In Starfield, where I know the familiar rarity system and I don't see any unique variants, I feel genuinely encouraged to try out everything. And with the customization available, I'm able to make that gun my own and give it its own story. I could buy a boring gun from a store and leave it as it is, or I could pick up a gun after an epic duel with a space pirate on a moon base, add a better scope, and name it Thundercloud. It's another instance where the onus is simply on the player to forge their own path. Exploration. This is a big one, and I think it's sensible to criticise the way exploration is structured in Starfield. The point A to point B on the ground stuff simply isn't here in the way it is in previous Bethesda games. Except, in a way, it still is. In Fallout 4, on your way from Sanctuary Hills to Diamond City, you'll experience a lot of random loot and empty buildings, and along the way you'll discover new quests and new locations. In Starfield, most of the major quests and locations are found in the major cities and other smaller named settlements. Inside the sizable cities you can explore for hours.
I am so grateful for you.
And in the process you'll pick up several quests just by listening to nearby NPCs. Land on a random planet though, and you'll find random loot and empty buildings. It's all still there, just split up in a way that puts the more interesting stuff where you're more likely to find it. In addition, in Starfield you have space exploration, where random ships will hail you with quests or to direct you to other star systems, which is pretty cool. You're less likely to stumble upon a big quest outside a settlement, but it does happen still. So it is different then, but so long as you understand some of how it works, then there is plenty of very rewarding exploration to be found here. If you enjoy exploring old research stations looking for loot and environmental storytelling, land on a random planet. But if you're here for quests and handcrafted stuff, then exploring any of the various settlements is an absolute treat. Seriously, take your time wandering around any of these settlements, and it is incredible how much there is to discover and engage with. And it's super exciting once you realise that basically any dialogue that you overhear could lead you on a new adventure.
Fine. You want to organize? There's some up in the back. See if you can't organize a little floor cleaning operation.
Outrageous! What? No, just, go away.
The story. I don't think Starfield's main story is groundbreaking by any means, but I do think it's a very good introduction to the world. And the ending, which I won't spoil here, can be incredibly impactful depending on how you've chosen to spend your time in this world. New Game Plus is pretty fantastic in its own way too, so much so that it's the first game which has properly convinced me to sink some time into a New Game Plus playthrough. I do think several of the main quests are a touch repetitive though, and I've already mentioned how much I hate the temple thing. But you know what? You only actually have to do one temple as part of the new story. And if even one temple is too much for you, you don't have to do the main quest at all. Because the story of Starfield can kind of be any combination of any of the stuff that the game offers to you, and whatever you bring to it as well.
By the authority of the Freestar Collective, stand down!
The faction quests are all like their own main stories by themselves, and that on top of numerous other quests. I didn't enjoy the temples, so I didn't visit them all. I just sort of followed my nose through the whole game and actually found it pretty exciting knowing just how much I was missing out on, because it was all stuff that I could come back to in a future playthrough. I knew there were several cool space powers I didn't get, and because there's an element of randomness in which temples even appear, I also knew I had a weird, unique selection of powers that would be completely different next time around. For what it's worth, I do wish there was an easier way to find the temples for specific powers though. Regardless, I thought the main story of Starfield was pretty good, but even if you don't, I still think there's something for everyone in this universe.
We got a live one here! FC security, stand down at once!
Concluding, there's more stuff people criticised in Starfield which I haven't talked about, and there's also plenty of stuff that people have praised as well, but I feel I've taken up more than enough of your time defending this game. People have every right not to enjoy Starfield still, but I hope I've convinced at least some people to give it the chance it deserves. When thinking about Starfield, I keep coming back to something that Todd Howard said in an IGN interview close to release. The more you give to Starfield, the more it gives back. Now, it's not as if this isn't true, at least to some extent, of most games, but I think it rings especially true with Starfield. Starfield is not a game which is easy to love from the beginning. It doesn't explain itself that well, and it doesn't grab you by the throat and shout about how awesome it is. But the more you learn and the more you settle into the universe, the more I think it has to offer. That still doesn't mean you have to do everything though. In almost every situation, when it's obvious an aspect of the game isn't for you, you can completely avoid engaging with it. If you stop trying to play a video game and choose instead to just live within this universe and be part of the story, it's likely you'll find a lot more to love about Starfield. Or maybe you won't, but at least you tried. Thanks for watching this video, and feel free to subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. You may have noticed during this video that I was wearing this Starfield watch from the Constellation edition of the game, which I was crazy enough to buy. If you'd like to hear me talk about how dumb collector's editions actually are, that video will be here and in the description when it's available. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.